A sharp voice cleaved through the cafeteria's murmur like a blade. "Move it, Grandpa! You're blocking the whole damn aisle!" The words hung in the air, jarring and unfiltered. It was followed by that sharp, uneven shove. A freestanding chair clattered backward and tumbled to the linoleum with a dull thud. Instantly, the line for the food counter froze. Trays paused in mid-hand, volunteers cut off in mid-serve. A hush rippled through the room. An old man's elbow collided with the edge of the table. He stumbled, rigid, breath catching in his chest. His hand quivered as he reached down, fingertips grazing the cold vinyl of the chair he'd just been pushed from. He straightened it, placing it back gently. The worn leather groaned softly. He didn't stagger. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. A silence thicker than the midday heat settled over the room. Plates clinked softly. The scent of canned soup and stale coffee hung in the stretched hush. Then someone moved. At the far end, a tall man rose from his seat. No fanfare, no clang of cutlery, just deliberate motion. The faint reflection of rank caught on a coat's collar as he stood. He didn't speak. He just watched. And the veteran, still trembling, took another breath, holding the chair steady as though he were the one bracing the room. But the colonel didn't speak. He simply watched. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The cafeteria smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and institutional soap, the kind that never quite covered the metallic trace of aging pipes and linoleum floors worn soft under years of use. Tuesday lunch at the Jefferson Community Recreation Center was always the busiest. Seniors from across the county came early to avoid the crowd, filling the long rectangular room with slow footsteps, murmured hellos, and the shuffle of folding chairs. At the corner table near the west wall, where sunlight filtered through thick plastic blinds and painted soft bars across the tile, there was a chair with a repaired leg, wrapped in silver duct tape in a careful spiral. It didn't wobble anymore, not since the man who always sat there had taken it home one afternoon in the back of a borrowed pickup, fixed it on his own bench, and returned it before anyone noticed it was gone. He came every Tuesday, alone, always 20 minutes early. He wore a clean brown jacket with the zipper pulled halfway, and an old green cap with the insignia of the United States Army Medical Department stitched above the brim. The thread frayed at the edges. His name was Edwin Langley. Most called him Ed. A few called him Sir, out of habit, though he never asked for it. Ed was 82. His gait was stiff, deliberate. The left leg dragged slightly, not from laziness, but from damage that no surgeon ever fully corrected. A stroke 3 years back had left his left arm with only partial motion, and he rarely raised it higher than his chest. But he carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that had nothing to prove. He brought his own fork, polished, not flashy, stainless steel with a rounded wooden handle. He didn't like the plastic ones they handed out in the buffet line, not because he thought he deserved better, but because he'd once seen a man choke on one during an evacuation in 1953. Since then, Ed never trusted something that could snap when things went wrong. Most weeks, he'd get the same meal: mashed potatoes, overcooked green beans, and a slice of mystery meat covered in brown gravy. He'd lift the tray slowly, never rushing, and take his place at the corner, eyes watching, hands steady. Some days he'd bring a book. Most days he just watched, not judging, just present. His presence was a ritual of steadiness in a place always shifting. New faces came and went, staff rotated, even the soup changed, but Ed remained. And now, on this particular Tuesday, that routine had been broken. The same hand that had once steadied a comrade's neck during battlefield triage now trembled faintly as it returned the chair upright. His face showed no fury, no shame, only stillness. He reached for his tray, now on the ground, and began slowly collecting the contents, one item at a time. A spoon slid across the floor. He left it. The napkin, soaked in spilled water, was folded back in half with care. The man who had pushed the chair was already seated again, laughing over his shoulder at someone across the room. His voice was just loud enough to be heard. "Should have installed turn signals on that walker." Laughter followed, shallow, nervous. Ed didn't respond. He placed the tray on the table and sat down again. Not the way a man retreats, the way a man resets. Outside, the wind carried a few early leaves against the windows, scraping softly as they fell. And just beyond that stillness, near the back exit, where few noticed him arrive and fewer noticed him rise, a man in a pressed jacket stood with his hands at his sides, his coffee untouched, his eyes fixed. Colonel Alan Merrick, freshly retired, didn't speak. But he didn't sit back down either. Ed pushed himself up from the chair with both hands flat against the table, his knees slow to obey. The movement wasn't sudden. Nothing about him ever was. But there was a deep deliberateness in the way his body lifted itself back into standing. He straightened slowly, steadying his weight over the left leg, giving it an extra moment, as if negotiating terms with an old enemy. The tray in his hand trembled slightly, but he gripped it with care. The ruined napkin had been tucked under one edge, folded despite the damp. The small puddle of gravy had been pushed aside with the edge of a credit card. Not a fuss, not a word, just the kind of quiet, practiced adjustment of a man who'd spent decades adapting without complaint. He took a step, then another. The shuffle of his left shoe, slower than the right, left a faint rubber squeak across the polished floor. In the far corner, where two plastic pitchers of sweet tea sweated on a table, a man in his late 40s leaned back in his chair with the cocky ease of someone who had never truly been corrected. His voice cut through the hum of resumed cafeteria noise. "Must have come here straight from the museum." The man beside him, leaner, younger, laughed behind a paper cup. Their table held 3 trays, 2 smartphones, and a half-finished crossword. None of them looked toward Ed. They didn't have to. Their amusement aimed sideways, safe in the crowd's hush. Ed made no reply. He continued forward, tray against his chest, past a volunteer in a green apron who stood frozen between a stack of foam cups and the hot plate. She looked at him, a moment of hesitation in her eyes, as if unsure whether to help or whether doing so would somehow add to his injury. But the moment passed, and her hand moved instead to refill the pitcher. The buffet line was shorter now. Most had already eaten. A few stragglers stood behind Ed, quietly waiting, eyes on the food, not the man. The plastic ladle slapped the side of the stew tray, sending the smell of cooked carrots and thick broth into the air. Ed accepted his portion with a small nod. He didn't ask for assistance. He never did. Returning to his seat was harder. His tray was heavier now. The floor seemed longer than before. At his table, the 2 men who had mocked him earlier now sat sideways in their chairs, legs stretched casually across the aisle. One had taken off his jacket and was tapping on his phone with one hand, chewing a toothpick with the other. The one who had pushed the chair now had his boot half turned into Ed's path. As Ed approached, he paused. Not long, just a fraction, a beat of breath. The man looked up and gave a crooked smile. "You wearing that hat like it still means something?" Ed's eyes flicked once toward him, then back to his tray. The medical insignia on the front of the cap, once olive green, now dulled with years, caught a glint of fluorescent light. It did mean something, just not to him. Ed shifted his balance and stepped over the man's boot without asking it to move. The younger one chuckled again, but the sound trailed off when Ed passed between them without a word. They watched but said nothing else, at least for now. At the back of the room, the colonel's posture hadn't changed. His hands remained at his sides. His gaze never wavered, but something in his stance was different now. A tension across the shoulders, a stillness, no longer observational, but anticipatory. And just beyond the windows, a single breeze pushed against the aging blinds, rattling them faintly. The cafeteria's hum had returned, but thinner now, as though the walls themselves were waiting, and no one stood. Yet. The tray rattled slightly as Ed reached the table. One of the legs, the one he'd repaired weeks ago, sat ever so uneven now, wobbling as the vinyl settled under weight. He adjusted it with one foot, steadying the chair before lowering himself into it. A hush pressed in from the corners of the room. Not total silence, just the weight of eyes pretending not to watch. Forks paused mid-air. A woman across the room, biting into a sandwich, slowed her motion, lips still parted. A man stirring his iced tea stopped, metal spoon resting still against the foam cup. Ed sat carefully, the effort visible in every movement. He drew his napkin out, the same one that had fallen, and gently folded it in half, placing it at the edge of his tray. The portion of stew on his plate had begun to spread across the divided sections, leaking into the vegetables, thinning the colors into a dull, wet palette of gray-brown and orange. He reached for his bread, trying to keep the tray steady, but the edge of the plastic plate slipped against the uneven table leg. Just enough. His hand jolted, and the tray tipped. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't crash, but the bowl of stew slid, tilting in slow betrayal. Half its contents spilled forward, landing in a wet, sudden pile across the table. A slice of carrot clung to the plate's rim and fell with a quiet plop onto the floor. Then came the laughter. Too loud, too fast. The first voice rose from that same table. The man with the phone, the boot, the swagger. "Well now, guess they don't teach tray balance in basic anymore." Another snort from his friend, sharper this time. "Come on, old-timer. Want us to cut your meat too?" Ed didn't speak. He reached for the edge of the tray to steady it again. Behind him, a chair scraped against the floor. A young woman, no older than 20, wearing the same green volunteer apron, stood. Her hands were clenched into fists. She took a step forward. "Sir," she said firmly, voice aimed toward the man, not Ed. "That's enough." The man turned toward her, eyebrows raised. He grinned like someone who enjoyed the attention. "Don't bother. You'll pull your back lifting him." More laughter, though now it was thinner. Some faces turned away. A man near the soda machine coughed loudly, though his eyes didn't meet hers. The girl looked like she might say something more, but she stopped. And Ed? He was already standing again. He bent, knees shaking, and reached for the napkin on the floor, the one that had caught the stew. He pressed it down slowly, blotting the orange slick beneath the chair. His hand trembled slightly, but he worked with calm, controlled motions. Not fast, not weak, just methodical. The other volunteer, the older one near the drink station, shifted her weight, watching. But she didn't come forward. Across the room, a man lifted his tray and quietly walked it to the trash, eyes down. Someone murmured, "Unbelievable," too softly to know whom they meant. At the back of the room, the colonel still stood. He hadn't moved from his spot. A single fluorescent light above Ed's table buzzed, then flickered. The windows were now glowing with the dull sheen of overcast sky, softening every shadow into haze. And in that strange, humming stillness, Edwin Langley, who had dressed wounds on strangers in field tents, who had once dug through rubble with his bare hands after a barracks collapsed in monsoon season, knelt before a cheap cafeteria chair, wiping soup from tile with a crumpled napkin, while younger, stronger men laughed over half-finished sandwiches. And still, Ed Langley didn't flinch. The stain had been mostly blotted now. The napkin, too soaked to do any more good, was folded one last time and placed at the edge of the tray, as if it still had a purpose. Ed stood slowly, using both palms against the table to lift himself, shoulders set in a square shape that seemed to hold more weight than his frame. The back of his neck was damp, not from sweat, but the heat that crept under old skin when fatigue sat too long behind the bones. No one helped him. No one stopped him. He eased himself back into the chair, the same chair that had been shoved not 15 minutes earlier, and adjusted the tray with care, sliding the edge until it sat just so. The food was cold now. A limp slice of bread stuck to the bottom of the plastic plate. A spoon, slightly bent from the fall, lay sideways in the stew. Still, Ed picked up the spoon with his right hand, the one that still obeyed, and dipped it gently into the broth. He brought it to his mouth without hesitation. Sipped. His breathing was measured, shallow but even. One knee trembled briefly beneath the table, and then stopped. He did not adjust it. He simply sat still, chewing each bite like it was the first one he'd ever had. Deliberate, clean, unhurried. Every movement was a ritual. The way he dabbed the corner of his mouth, the manner in which he refolded the napkin with 2 fingers, the precision with which he rearranged the tray's contents to match his preference. Proteins left, bread at top right, cutlery centered. It wasn't just habit. It was a language, one only men like Ed ever spoke. A language of control, order, and pride held tight in the palm, even when all else had shaken loose. There were no more jokes from the other table. Their laughter had faded, replaced by quiet chewing and the occasional scrape of a fork against plastic. One of the men now sat slightly turned away, pretending to check something on his phone. The other glanced down at his cup, then into it, then away again, as if his tea had somehow soured. Ed noticed none of it, or if he did, he gave no sign. His focus remained on the act of eating, as if this moment, this meal, was something earned, something sacred. There was something profoundly military in the way he sat there, not in appearance, no medals, no posture of command, but in the stillness, the quiet defiance, the refusal to give weight to the insult by acknowledging it. That, too, was learned, earned. Somewhere behind him, a door opened and shut softly. The faint sound of distant conversation filtered in. A pair of maintenance workers speaking in low voices, muffled by the long hallway. And then across the room, a chair creaked. Colonel Alan Merrick hadn't touched his coffee. It sat cooling in front of him, the steam now faded, the rim still unblemished. He had not so much as lifted a utensil since the moment the chair was knocked over. He was standing now, but not fidgeting, not stretching. He stood the way only certain men stand, with the same bearing whether in a courtroom, a barracks, or a cafeteria. The fluorescent light caught the faint shimmer of the oak leaf insignia on the collar of his jacket, half obscured by the flap of his coat. And though no one else in the room had quite noticed yet, the waitress in the apron, the young one, had. She saw the rank. She saw the eyes that hadn't blinked. And she saw the way he began walking, not fast, not angry, toward the center aisle. Every fork in the room paused mid-air, but no one knew yet what he would do. The steps were not hurried, nor heavy, but each one carried the weight of presence, the kind of quiet momentum that draws notice without intention. Colonel Alan Merrick walked the length of the community center's cafeteria, like a man who had inspected many formations in his time, and who had grown less interested in being seen than in seeing clearly. He passed between 2 folding tables, his hands loose at his sides, his boots clicking faintly on the linoleum floor. One small boy, no older than 6, looked up from his tray of fruit cups and string cheese, eyes wide. The colonel gave no signal, no nod. He didn't need to. Children sensed stillness, like deer sensed storms. Behind the table where Ed Langley now sat, spoon lifted again, calm, unshaking. The colonel came to a full stop, not abrupt, just final. He did not speak. He didn't look down at the man seated before him. Instead, Colonel Merrick turned his head slightly, just enough to take in the figure still sitting 2 tables over. The man with the thick arms, the broad shoulders, the smug confidence now wilting beneath the hush. The man's jaw flexed. His voice, when it came, was meant to sound amused, but it landed cracked. "What, you got something to say?" No answer. The colonel didn't turn to face him. He didn't acknowledge him at all. He stepped once to the side and gently reached down toward the ground near Ed's chair. The napkin, the one stained from stew, mottled and soft, still lay slightly curled under the edge of the table. He picked it up slowly, folding it into a neat square, then placed it next to the plate on the tray as if setting a ritual into order. A woman gasped very softly behind her hand. Ed, still holding his spoon, froze for just a breath, his eyes flicking to the man's boots. They were polished, even in civilian wear. Brown leather, broken in, but cared for. No scuffs at the toe. Colonel Merrick then took a step back. And, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for memory, not men, he pulled the chair behind Ed's tray outward, just enough for a man to sit. The motion was slow, careful, exact, but he did not take the seat. He stood behind it, straight and unbending, hands clasped behind his back, boots together, eyes forward, and he stood at attention. No words, no declaration, no ceremony, only posture, only silence. The cafeteria had not been this quiet all day. The table where the mocking man sat was no longer laughing. One of his friends now looked away, picking at a sandwich as if it might disappear if ignored long enough. The man himself, whose name no one yet knew, reached for his phone with a hand that fumbled slightly against the table. But no one looked at him now. They looked at the colonel. They looked at Ed, at the silent dignity of one and the deliberate, immovable presence of the other. Somewhere in the back kitchen, a timer beeped, but no one moved to silence it. A cart rattled against a wall and stopped. The young volunteer at the drink station stood with both hands pressed flat against the countertop, unmoving. It was the kind of silence that did not require volume to make a point. It was the kind of silence that carried a verdict. Ed's hand lowered the spoon slowly to the tray. He did not turn, not yet, but the lines around his eyes deepened, not from tension, but recognition. He knew what this was, and so did every man in the room who had ever worn a uniform. The colonel never looked at the man who had shoved the chair. He only stood and stayed standing. For a moment, the cafeteria felt like a church, not the kind filled with hymns and incense, but the kind left open late at night, hushed, empty, dim, the kind where something bigger than sound was speaking. Colonel Merrick remained behind the chair, hands still clasped behind his back. His spine was straight, shoulders squared, chin level, eyes steady, gazing not into the middle distance but slightly downward, toward the table where Edwin Langley's plate sat. A bead of stew had begun to crust on the lip of the bowl. Ed, for his part, did not turn. He didn't need to. Men like Ed didn't chase attention. They recognized it when it stood quietly beside them. A man 2 tables over set down his sandwich. The paper crinkled slightly, then was still. Even the volunteers behind the counter, 3 of them in green aprons, were frozen in place, mid-movement. A ladle sat hovering above a pot. A hand rested on the edge of the serving window. Then, like the soft creak of old wood shifting beneath weight, a sound rose from the side of the room. The chair across from the one Ed had sat in, the one near the tray return, slid out slowly. Colonel Merrick bent slightly at the waist. It wasn't exaggerated, just enough to meet the edges of the ritual with respect. With both hands, he took the cloth napkin that had been refolded earlier and set it square in the center of the table. Then, with deliberate motion, he took the silverware and aligned it, parallel and quiet. Ed's breathing, though still calm, drew slightly deeper. Without needing permission, the colonel moved the chair just an inch or 2 closer to the table, a silent offering. He never touched Ed. He never spoke. He stood again and resumed his position, still, upright, at attention. The man who had shoved the chair earlier shifted in his seat, arms now crossed loosely, not defiant, but defensive. His face, which had held a smirk not long ago, now seemed to search for neutral expression, but found only fidgeting discomfort. The silence deepened, no longer awkward, but sacred. Somewhere, a woman at the end of the room began to stand. She didn't speak. She only placed her hand on the back of her own chair and remained there, eyes on the old man at the center of the moment. And then, as if moved by an unseen cue, another man rose, then another. Not all at once, just one at a time, like respect returning to a room that had forgotten its posture. A young man near the window put down his phone and slid it across the table away from himself. His head bowed, just slightly. Ed finally turned his head, slow, steady. He looked up toward the colonel, not with disbelief, but with that quiet appraisal shared between soldiers who don't need names to recognize depth. Their eyes met. And in that brief, flickering stillness, decades folded like paper. A shared understanding passed between them, unspoken, whole, not about the stew, or the chair, or the room, but about what it meant to hold your ground, even when the world stopped watching. The cafeteria, for the first time since Ed had entered, was completely, reverently silent. Edwin Langley's head had turned fully now, but he didn't rise. He didn't need to. His body, worn down by years and stitched up bones, remained still, but his eyes, those soft steel-gray eyes that had once squinted against jungle glare and field hospital floodlights, locked onto Colonel Merrick's like the fastening of a clasp, long buried. They had never met in life, but they had met in kind. What passed between them in that moment was not recognition of face, but recognition of form, the posture, the silence, the refusal to make a scene when dignity could make the point sharper than any shout ever could. Colonel Merrick didn't blink. He didn't nod. He simply stood, a living guard behind Ed's seat, like a sentry who had returned home late, but just in time. Ed's jaw moved slightly, a faint motion, not quite a smile, the kind of gesture a soldier might give from a stretcher, knowing the morphine was kicking in, knowing the medic knew what to do. It wasn't gratitude, it was trust. The air in the cafeteria felt heavier now, not with tension, but with reverence. Even the fluorescent lights overhead seemed quieter. The dull hum they emitted dimmed beneath the silence that had taken hold of every soul in the room. A woman by the tray return wiped her hands on a towel she had already dried 3 times. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just watched. One hand pressed lightly to her chest. A tray clinked gently as someone set it down near the sink, not wanting to break the hush. A child at the far corner whispered something to his mother, but the mother simply gave a small shake of her head. Not now. Not yet. And still, Ed sat. Colonel Merrick stood. And between them, nothing. And everything. Then, without breaking eye contact, the colonel reached slowly into his coat. No one flinched. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't showy. It was something sacred. Something being retrieved, not for attention, but for meaning. His fingers slid into the inside breast pocket. What emerged wasn't a medal, not a flag, not even a military badge. It was a leather folder, black, thin, creased slightly at the edge from years of careful use. The kind a man carries not because it's fashionable, but because it has never let him down. He opened it slowly, like turning the page of something private, reverent. Inside, tucked against the flap, was a single photograph, not glossy, not recent. Its corners were worn, edges softened from years of being handled, protected, remembered. He removed it with both hands, cradling it as one might cradle a fragile heirloom, not for drama, but for respect. Colonel Merrick leaned slightly forward, just enough to place the photo on the table beside Ed's tray. He did not explain. He did not gesture. He simply set it there and stood back. Ed turned his eyes toward it. The picture showed a younger man, face streaked with blood, eyes wide not with pain but panic, lying on the dirt of a training field, one hand clutching his side. Kneeling beside him, focused, calm, and unmistakably younger by 4 decades, was a United States Army medic. One knee in the dust, a hand to the shoulder, a gauze wrap unrolled in midair. Ed's spoon clattered softly against the edge of his tray. He stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked up, just once, at the colonel. His lips parted slightly. No words came out, but Merrick gave a single nod, firm, grounded. Still silence, but something shifted. In the room, in Ed, in the air. Colonel Merrick's voice, when it came, was low, not heavy with command, but steady, like a stream that had waited years to find the right stone to run across. He didn't speak to Ed. He didn't speak to the man who had shoved the chair. He spoke to the room. "I was using this earlier today," he said, his gaze still on the photo resting beside Ed's tray. "Speaking to a few local cadets. Leadership seminar, upstairs. Some of you may have seen the flyers." His eyes lifted slightly, surveying the faces now turned toward him. No one looked away. "I brought this photo as an example," he continued. "Not of myself, but of the kind of man I wanted them to learn from." He placed both hands on the back of Ed's chair, not gripping, not imposing, just anchoring the moment. "That's me," he said softly, motioning slightly to the wounded figure in the picture. "Fort Sam Houston, 1991. I was 19 years old. Officer candidate school had chewed me up for 3 weeks. It was raining, and during a field maneuver, I tripped over exposed rebar, tore a deep cut right under my rib. I was panicking." His eyes dropped to the image again. "And that's him," he said. "Specialist Edwin Langley, volunteer instructor, retired by then. Didn't have to be there. He saw me go down from across the clearing. I remember thinking, this guy walks like he's made of old rope and nails. What's he going to do?" A few people chuckled softly. It was not mocking. It was relief, the kind that comes when truth lands gently, not like a gavel, but like a salve. But he got to me faster than anyone else. Quiet, quick, no panic in his hands. He knelt like he'd been doing it since birth. Said 4 words I never forgot. He paused. "You're gonna be fine." Colonel Merrick drew a slow breath, deeper now, as though the memory still wrapped itself around his lungs. He patched me up in minutes, calm, focused, talked to me the whole time, not just about the wound, but about being scared, about what kind of fear helps you stay alert, and what kind breaks your team. And then he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You want to lead men? Then start by learning how to stay still when your blood's hot." Merrick turned slightly now, his voice expanding, not louder, but more open, as if inviting everyone present into the story. After that, I never forgot his face, never forgot those hands, and I never forgot the way he stood up when he was done, brushed the mud off his knees and didn't wait for a thank you. A hush filled the room like slow smoke. The clinking of trays had stopped. Even the kitchen door had closed at some point, sealing in the silence like a sanctuary. Colonel Merrick's eyes turned, finally, toward Ed. Still seated, still quiet, though his hand now rested atop the photograph. Fingers splayed gently across the faded paper, like it was something breakable. "I didn't know for sure it was you until just now," the colonel said. "Not when I came in, not when I saw you take your seat. But when I saw you clean the mess with your own napkin, I knew. That's how you moved. That's how you worked." He stepped slightly to the side now, turning back toward the room. "This man didn't just teach us how to stop bleeding," he said. "He taught us how to carry ourselves when no one is looking, how to lead without saying a word." He scanned the room again, not searching for applause, but holding each gaze that dared meet his. "You mocked him," he said, finally turning toward the man who had pushed the chair. "You pushed him. You insulted his walk. You called him a burden. But the only burden in this room is what you've got to live with now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply stepped back behind Ed's chair and resumed standing, not to dominate, but to stand guard once more. And for the first time, the man who had shoved Ed didn't know what to do with his hands. He fidgeted with his watch, looked down, shifted in his seat. The confidence was gone. All that remained was heat rising to his ears and a silence he couldn't outrun. And across the room, Ed Langley closed his eyes, just for a breath, not to escape, but to remember. No one moved right away. It was as if the very air inside the cafeteria had thickened, not with tension now, but with something softer and far heavier. Reflection. Colonel Merrick stood still, his hands once again folded behind his back, no longer facing the man who had pushed Ed Langley, but instead turned toward the center of the room where all eyes had begun to settle. For a heartbeat, it felt as if time had stepped out of its shoes and gone barefoot, walking gently across the linoleum floor. Then, a sound, the creak of a microphone being lifted from its stand. At the far corner, beside a folding table scattered with sign-in sheets and paper name tags, the event organizer stepped forward. An older woman, dignified, spine straight despite the years, held the mic in both hands as if cradling something alive. She cleared her throat once, softly, not to command attention, only to mark that she was, at last, ready to speak. "There are moments," she said, her voice carrying more weight than volume, "when a place shows you who it belongs to." She looked across the room, pausing on Ed. Her mouth trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. She wasn't there to perform, only to witness. "We've had this seat here near the wall for almost 20 years. Always near the coffee, always under that squeaky fan." A few in the crowd smiled faintly. The squeak had become part of the rhythm of Tuesdays, almost like a clock. The woman stepped away from the table and crossed the floor slowly, carrying something in her other hand. Folded linen, white and pressed. She reached Ed's table, stopping just in front of his tray. With reverent hands, she laid the cloth across the tabletop, smoothing the corners until it draped neatly, precisely. Then, from beneath it, she produced a small bronze plaque, no larger than a folded bill. She turned to the crowd. "We won't call this a ceremony," she said, "because he never asked for one. But from this day forward, this table, this seat, belongs to Specialist Edwin Langley." She set the plaque at the table's edge, its engraved surface catching just a hint of light. No one clapped. It wasn't the kind of moment that called for it. One by one, people began to rise. First a woman with a cane, then a man with a Veterans of Foreign Wars pin tucked into the side of his baseball cap. Then 2 young volunteers who had barely touched their meals. One of them placed her tray gently on the counter, her eyes wet. At the back of the room, someone lowered the American flag hanging above the community board, just slightly, not ceremonially, but as if bowing. Colonel Merrick stepped back once, just a half step, then stood once more, still as granite. The man who had shoved Ed sat, slumped, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His hands had stopped moving. And Ed, he didn't smile. He didn't weep. He simply reached forward, adjusted his fork against the cloth, and straightened the plaque with 2 fingers, not because it was crooked, but because it deserved that much care. Then, softly, almost to himself, he nodded once, not to the crowd, not to the colonel, but to the moment, and that was enough. 1 week later, the Tuesday morning sun found the rec center glowing with a faint warmth, its parking lot dotted with aging sedans and pickup trucks, paint dulled by time, but still proudly parked in straight rows. The cafeteria doors opened at exactly 10:30, as they always did, letting in the familiar mix of footsteps, low voices, and the clatter of trays being arranged on warming carts. But something had changed. Near the back wall, beneath the slightly crooked ceiling fan, and next to the coffee dispenser with its chipped handle, Ed Langley's table was already set, not just reserved, but readied. A cloth napkin, white and clean, a glass of water filled halfway, and the plaque, polished now, gleaming like it had always been there, not for decoration, but as a silent promise. Ed did not walk in alone. To his right strode Gerald Vickers, Gulf War vet, cane tapping steadily with each step. To his left, Hector Silva, United States Navy, 30 years retired, a man of few words and precise movements. Neither had known Ed well before last week, but now they matched his pace like they'd done it for years. They didn't speak, they just walked, like sentinels who had nothing left to prove. Other veterans followed, some standing near, some choosing tables nearby. A few wore service jackets, most did not. But every one of them gave a nod to Ed as they passed, and every nod was returned with one of his own, brief, exact, and wordless. Even the younger volunteers, whose laughter used to carry freely across the space, now lowered their tones just slightly as they served, not somber, but respectful, as if they'd learned a new rhythm, a new volume. At Ed's table, no seat was empty. Hector poured the coffee without being asked. Gerald passed the salt without a word. And Ed, slow, deliberate, steady, unfolded his napkin, adjusted it on his lap, and began to eat. Not hurried, not hesitating, as though everything was finally in its place. Across the room, The man who had shoved Ed the week before sat alone, not in shame, but in thought. His shoulders were less squared now, less sure. He hadn't touched his coffee, but he had cleared 3 trays from nearby tables already, unasked, unnoticed. Once he passed by Ed's table, slowed, opened his mouth, closed it again. He didn't apologize, but he lingered near the plaque a second too long before walking away, and Ed, without looking up, gave a single nod in his direction. That was enough. Tuesdays became something new in the weeks that followed. No one called it anything. There were no flyers, no announcements, but word spread. Veterans began to show up earlier. Some brought friends, some brought silence. They didn't gather for speeches. They came for coffee, and for one another. And every Tuesday, that seat by the wall stayed occupied. Not always by Ed, but always by someone who had earned it. It became a living reminder, not of glory, not of battle, but of presence, of dignity, of showing up, week after week, quiet, unshakable. A tribute not to what they had survived, but to how they still stood. And Ed? He simply kept coming. Same time, same seat, same precise way of folding his napkin before cutting his toast. A man who had never asked for honor, and finally received it. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.